Good morning, Pittman Elementary. We will continue reading Ranger in Time, Rescue on the Oregon Trail. We are on Chapter 11. Dangerous Crossing is the title. It was the middle of August when the Abbotts made camp along the Snake River, getting ready to cross. That was the day Sam finally understood why his parents had been arguing. He and Lizzie had gone to collect kindling near the river. They were walking back to the wagons when Ma's voice came drifting over the tall grass. "It's not worth a day or two. It's not worth 100 more days on the trail if we lose you, William." Lizzie noticed for Sam to stay low, and they crouched to listen. Ranger saw a dragonfly and started to jump at it, but Sam grabbed him around the neck and pulled him close. "Shh! Quiet, dog. This is a man's decision. I've set my mind to crossing in the morning." Ma's voice came back just as strong. "It's a foolish man's decision. This crossing is treacherous. The number of men who have crossed have drowned." Sam didn't hear what she said next because Lizzie let out a great sneeze, and the conversation by the wagon either ended or became so hushed that they couldn't hear anymore. "Come on," Lizzie gathered up the sticks and dry weeds she'd set on the ground. "We'd best get this back for the fire." "Do you think we'll cross?" Sam whispered, and they started back towards the wagon. Lizzie shrugged. "It's Pa's choice," she said. "He seems set on doing it." "What if it's dangerous?" Sam's voice was full of worry. Ranger trotted closer and nudged his hand. "Everything's dangerous out here," Lizzie said. "But we'll be fine. Ma frets too much." In the morning, Pa paid some Shoshone men to ferry the wagons to the other side of the river. That's how Ma, Lizzie, Sam, Amelia, Baby Isaac, and Ranger crossed too. They were on the far side of the river when Pa and the other men mounted their horses to drive the livestock across. Ma stood in the mud at the edge of the river. Sam could hear her whispering prayers. 3-Island Crossing was named for the 3 islands in the middle of the Snake River. Travelers used 2 of those islands to get across. The guidebook said getting from shore to the first island wasn't too difficult, and crossing from the first island to the second wasn't bad either. The last crossing from the second island to the shore was the longest and hardest. 300 yards with a mean, fast current. Sam wasn't sure if it was last night's rain or the fact that his father had to cross soon that made the river look so swollen and fast and hungry today. "Here they come," Lizzie said, squinting across the river. Dr. Loring and a couple of the men from the Missouri came first, driving their cattle in front of them. They crossed to the first island and then the second, just as the guidebooks directed. Their cattle were mostly across the last stretch from the second island to shore when Dr. Loring's horse reared up. "Oh no!" Ma sucked in her breath, and they all watched as Dr. Loring clung to the reins, squeezing his saddle with his knees, trying to stay on. Sam couldn't tell what had happened to his horse, whether it stepped in a hole or got spooked by something in the water. But somehow Dr. Loring managed to settle it down and get it moving again. When the horse climbed up the bank next to them and shook itself off, Ma let out a deep breath. But then she tensed right back up again. Pa and Mr. Harrigan are starting out now. Lizzie pointed to the far shore. Sam watched as they urged the cattle onto the river and began to follow on their horses. Mr. Harrigan's horse, Bess, trotted right into the water, but Old Nugget, Pa's horse, took a few steps and paused and pawed at the water, making great splashes as if this were all a game. It made Sam feel better that the horses seemed to like the river. The water wasn't deep, only just past their knees, at least for now. Sam reached into his pocket and held the quilt squares tight as Pa and Mr. Harrigan drove the cattle across the first island. Nugget climbed up onto the shore and shook himself. That wasn't so bad. Lizzie had gone over to stand by Ma. "1 down, 2 to go," Ma whispered. Her hands were clenched so tightly at her chin that her fingers were white. The second part of the crossing went smoothly until the very end, when a gust of wind blew Pa's hat off his head. Mr. Harrigan leaned over to reach for it, but between the wind and the current, it was carried off sight in seconds. Sam wondered what would happen to someone who fell into the water, but he didn't say it out loud. Ma was already humming faster than a bumblebee. On the second island, Pa and Mr. Harrigan brought their horses close together. There they are, trying to get across the river. Ma paced back and forth. Dr. Loring came up, still all soggy from the river, and put a hand on her shoulder. They're going to be just fine, Mary. They were watching right close when I crossed. They'll stay clear of that trouble spot. I'm sure that's what they're talking about now. I hope you're right. Ma's voice sounded thankful but shaky. When Dr. Loring left to his cattle, Ranger came to stand by her. I suppose you're looking for bacon, she said, hands on her hips. Well, dog, if they come through this safe and sound, you can have a whole slab of it. How's that? Ranger licked Ma's hand. Bacon was good, but mostly he wanted Pa and Mr. Harrigan to come so everyone would stop feeling so scared and edgy. Ranger hated that prickly neck hair feeling. It was everywhere now, in the dust and the wind and the water. Danger. Okay. Chapter 12, Into the River. Here they come, Lizzie said, taking a deep breath. Pa and Mr. Harrigan drove the cattle back into the river and set out from the second island. At first, the horses' gaits were strong and sure, but the river got deeper fast. Soon Nugget was straining to keep his chin out of the water. Come on, Sam whispered. Keep coming, Nugget. He was staring so hard at Pa and Nugget that he didn't notice what was happening to Mr. Harrigan. Bess was trying to follow Pa and Nugget, but the current seemed to be pushing her downstream closer and closer to the spot where Dr. Loring had trouble. Watch out, Sam shouted. It's too deep there. But Mr. Harrigan couldn't hear him over the water. Bess was already struggling to keep her head out of the rushing river. Mr. Harrigan was close enough for Sam to see the fear on his face. He jerked the reins, but Bess was too spooked to obey. Sam could hear her whinnying and snorting. Her gait was jerky and unsure. She looked like she might rear up any second and throw Mr. Harrigan into the river, and there wasn't a thing Sam could do to stop it. So he screamed again, "It's too deep!" Even though he knew the river would swallow up his words. At that moment, Pa turned and looked over his shoulder. He yanked his reins and turned Nugget around to go back. Oh, Lord, Ma whispered, clenching her hands together, shaking her head. It's okay, Ma, Sam tried to comfort her. Pa's got him. Look. Nugget was a bigger, sturdier horse. Pa rode him right up alongside Bess to keep her pushing against the river's current, and then they were moving forward again toward shore and safety. You see? Sam squeezed his mother's trembling hand and looked up at her tear-streaked face. Pa took care of it. Here they come. No, Ma screamed. Sam turned in time to see Nugget going wild in the water. He didn't buck once and settle down like Dr. Loring's horse had. Nugget reared up over and over, kicking his front legs at the air as if he could fight off some invisible enemy. Pa couldn't hold on. He lost his grip on the reins, slid off the horse, and splashed into the river. There he is. Mr. Harrigan was right there. Should have been close enough to grab him, but the water was frothing white with stomping horse hooves and current and mud. Mr. Harrigan leaned down from his horse, hands stretched out, but Pa was already gone. No, Ma wailed again. She splashed into the river up to her knees, staring out at the deep water as if she could tug Pa into shore with her eyes. Sam couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. He could only stare as Mr. Harrigan jerked his head around, searching, looking. Ranger ran to Sam and lifted his nose. He could smell Pa's scent in the air, along with everyone else and the horses and the cattle. He smelled sage and bacon grease from the breakfast and rain from last night. And above it all, he sensed cold, raw fear. There, Sam hollered so hard his throat burned. He pointed to a spot in the river just a few feet downstream. Pa was barely keeping his head above water, trying to swim back to the horses. Mr. Harrigan turned Bess and tried to guide her there, but it was deeper water, and she was already too spooked. Pa disappeared again. When he surfaced the next time, it was farther away. Sam only saw his face for a second before the river pulled him back. Ranger saw it too. He'd heard this kind of shouting and seen this splashing once before in a river in the mountains near Luke's house. Swift water training. Dad had called it. Ranger and Luke had come along while Dad and the other rescue crew members practiced saving people who fell in the water. Ropes. There were lots of ropes. Ranger broke away from Sam and raced for the wagon. Okay, that's the end of chapter 12.